There is a perplexing paradox at the heart of the practice of teshuvah. On one hand, teshuvah is universally available, even radically so. By definition, it cannot be meted out according to merit, since teshuvah is the mechanism provided to us by God to facilitate our return from past mistakes. To say that only some sinners have access to teshuvah would delimit the expanse and reach of God's forgiving nature. But on the other hand, there have to be some limits and definitive features of teshuvah, else it would fall into incoherence and nihilism, chas v'shalom, which would also undermine God's forgiving power by rendering it meaningless. As the Talmud states, for one who says, I will sin, and then I'll do teshuvah, teshuvah does not suffice. Thus, teshuvah is both radically expansive and accessible, but also delimited. How can we suss this out? This seeming contradiction is embodied neatly in a pair of traditions about the heavenly bat kol, the echo of God's voice, and its involvement in the spiritual practice of teshuvah. One version of the tradition goes accordingly. Each day, a bat kol issues forth from Har Chorev, Sinai, shouting in a voice that resounds throughout the whole world, "Return, my wayward children." In this version, the rabbis underscore the universal nature of teshuvah, which particularly reaches those who find themselves lost. The sound of teshuvah reverberates throughout the whole world. No one can miss this unignorable call. As the oft-quoted biblical verse says, we are like water spilled on the ground that cannot be gathered back in. God rejects this, rather devising ways so the banished are not left forsaken. Shuvah is precisely the embodiment of God's radical commitment that no one is ever truly left abandoned. God's overwhelming power manifests not merely in the achievement of miracles or the defeat of wicked kings, but also in radical inclusivity, a love which refuses to give up on anyone. However, another version of this tradition adds in a surprising, perhaps even painful twist. In Chagiga 15a, the text reads, a bat kol goes out and says, "Return, my wayward children, except for Acher." In this rendering, the rabbis do not stress the spatial reach of the bat kol's voice, nor do they mark that this is a daily occurrence. The most salient feature appears at the end, in which teshuvah is promised to all, but precluded from one person, the infamous other, Elisha ben Abuya, the prototypical rabbinic heretic. While in the first version, teshuvah is pledged to each person who finds themselves in a lost state, in this edition, it seems one can remove oneself from the ambit of God's forgiving faculty. There may even be a parallel between the case of the heretic and that of the inauthentic Baal Teshuvah mentioned above, who says, I will sin and then I'll do teshuvah. To see teshuvah not as a means to make repair, to learn from one's mistakes, and grow into a better person, but rather as a license to misbehave, is to misunderstand something as essential to Judaism as monotheism. Are we left then with an irresolvable contradiction? Are there some poor, unfortunate souls left beyond the ambit of teshuvah's reach? To put it another way, wouldn't it precisely be a test of teshuvah's radical expansiveness if even these sinners still have teshuvah available to them? That is precisely how the Netivot Shalom, a 20th century Hasidic Rabbi Shalom Noach Berzovsky, relates to this dilemma. To him, it is simply inconceivable that teshuvah is denied to some sinners. After all, sin is the phenomenon to which teshuvah is designed to respond. However, could sin exempt certain people from access to teshuvah? To resolve this problem, the Netivot Shalom proposes a more complex account of teshuvah's manifestation in this world. In Kabbalah, there are two kinds of awakenings, which correspond to two dynamics, from above and from below. That is, there are times God reaches down and stirs something up within this world. Other times, we human beings take the initiative and awaken God, as it were, from below. To the Netivot Shalom, teshuvah works in a correlative manner. The cry of the bat kol discussed above describes God's reaching out to us, reassuring us we are not forever lost, affirming that forgiveness is still available, and encouraging us to do the work on ourselves that we are fully capable of doing. This is our own spiritual awakening from above, not done through anything of our own merit, but rather an expression of God's own promise of expansive acceptance and eternal love. It's the voice in us that tells us to keep on going, even if we feel we don't deserve it. However, that internal stirring is not apparent to everyone. We often think of sin as a performance of a bad or even wicked act. But the Netivot Shalom reorients our understanding in a more relational capacity. To sin, in his perspective, is to bring distance between one and God. So, the reason Acher's spiritual antenna did not receive the bat kol's broadcast was not because he was ultimately unworthy, but rather he had engaged in a path that brought himself away from the divine. Similarly, one who intends to sin and have teshuvah clean up after one's mess is tuned into a different frequency than one oriented towards forgiveness. To this person, teshuvah is something external and detached from one's soul and intention. It has nothing to do with what one is trying to do, but rather it is counterposed to it. It is a complete inversion of the nature of teshuvah, and thus this person does not possess the capacity to receive the promise of God's unflagging acceptance, since they are only looking for an excuse to do merely what they wanted to do. So while the awakening of teshuvah from above is emanated to all people, there are certain persons who are not kept from this by God, but rather keep themselves from even being able to sense it burbling in their hearts. It's there for them as well, but they just can't hear it, because they can't listen. They don't know how. Or they've convinced themselves they can't. But there is no situation in which teshuvah is not accepted. So how is teshuvah still in some way available even to these lost and forlorn? There is still the awakening from below. While the reverberating promise of God's love and acceptance may not be apparent to them, they are still always able to turn things around on their own terms. Those who have negated or evacuated teshuvah of meaning have a harder path to walk than those who have merely strayed, for they need to learn how to make their way back to teshuvah itself. At some point, they stopped believing in teshuvah's reality, seeing it as a mere formality, or something that is not essentially connected to one's choices or intentions. In a case like that, one must do teshuvah on teshuvah, repairing one's relation with this premise, which is in truth repairing one's relation with oneself. Relearning how to believe in one's promise, in one's potential, in one's ability to change and make change, in one's indelible worth and divinely endowed dignity. This is the awakening from below, which can never be shut down, save if we block it ourselves. In a sense, these seeming lost causes did end up serving as the true tests of the inestimable power of teshuvah, since we see in them how God's promise is fulfilled. No one will ever truly be forsaken, since we are always present with ourselves. We can be the fulfillment of that promise when we bring ourselves on the path back home. Until now, our discussion is focused on a kind of prescriptive category, the sinner, or even the heretic. who have removed themselves from the immediate and apparent reach of God's concern. Here, I want to expand this category in a more psychological, more descriptive direction. I imagine that during the slog of quarantine, many of us, too, are having trouble tuning in to the broadcast of God's available presence. The holy days, especially, are marked by this absence, as their communal, celebratory nature is altered and truncated. The incredible spiritual technology of the Luach, the Jewish calendar, may not be working its magic for everyone this year, and this is totally understandable. But it is just in this case, too, that teshuvah's astounding nature is shown. The rabbis in Rosh Hashanah 18a associate the 10 days of teshuvah which span between the New Year and Yom Kippur, in which Shabbat Shuvah, this Shabbos, is situated. They associate it with a certain pasuk, a certain verse. Seek God where God may be found. Call to God while God is close. It's from Isaiah 55:6. Also actually taken from one of the Haftorahs that we read during the 7 weeks of comfort. Along the lines of what we have discussed above, I'd like to propose an alternate rendering of this striking verse. It is in seeking God that God is found. In calling God, God is close. It is in our very seeking and reaching out to God that God's presence may be encountered. We do not need to wait for a voice from heaven to give us permission, but rather teshuvah shows us that our daring to reach out brings us before God as well. All we need to do is try. Sometimes that is enough. Sometimes that is all we find ourselves able to do. But it is only in trying that teshuvah can be found. Gemar Chatima Tova and Shabbat Shalom.